In May, when George Floyd was murdered, I've been working, I've been active in anti-racist work at Stonebridge School of the Sacred Heart, where I work. And I asked the director of diversity, what can I do? What can I do as a white Jewish woman? What can I do? And she lovingly, but firmly told me that I knew what to do. So I have spent this summer and the fall bringing anti-racist programming to my neighborhood. And tonight I'm so thrilled with the partnership with JCRC and my buddies Jana and Allison for helping us bring this very important programming to Bethel. So I am so thrilled to introduce Rabbi Abbi Sharovsky. So JCRC is the Jewish Communities Relations Council. It's this phenomenal group that, quite frankly, I was somewhat new to. I knew my friend Erwin won an award from them, and the Stillmans won this year. But they are a phenomenal resource in our community, of which Bethel is a member. So if you go on JCRC, I think it's .org, you'll see fabulous anti-racist information. And it's just a fabulous partnership between the Jewish community and people of color. So Rabbi Abbi, graduated from JTTS. She was ordained in 2012. She also holds her master's degree from the Davidson School of Jewish Education. And I love this, her master's specializing in experiential Jewish education. And we could see her passion and her just great out-of-the-box thinking when we work with her for this programming. She was also the Deputy Director of Jewish Welfare Board, Jewish Chaplains Council, and she worked with Rabbis Without Borders. She was a fellow, and she currently serves on the Executive Council of the Rabbinical Assembly. Rabbi Abbi lives in Silver Spring with her husband, David, and their 2 children. So we are so grateful to the partnership with JCRC, and welcome to Rabbi Abbi, who will be guiding us tonight.
Thank you, Sharon. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to see so many people. And so thank you for putting your screens on. It's always good when I get to actually see some faces. And tonight we're going to be learning together a little bit about race, anti-racism, what all of that means, and exploring words and ideas that are sometimes uncomfortable. Especially when we talk about things like privilege and race. So one of the things that I like to lay out from the beginning is that I pretty much guarantee there will be something at some point where you and I will not agree. And I am totally okay with that. And I hope you are too, because the goal of this is to not get you to think just like me. It's to get you to think in general. We should all just be thinking about these things. These are, and it's okay to be a little bit uncomfortable with what we're doing. If we're too comfortable, we're not doing something right. And we need to be able to get into all of this and trust ourselves and trust each other to go through this journey. So I encourage you to talk with each other, to use the chat feature, to do that, to ask questions. I may not get to your question right away, and hopefully Sharon, Allison, or Jana will be able to see it and jump in perhaps. I encourage you to take notes, write things down or not. There will be a part where you will need to either like check some things off or keep track. So if you do have a piece of paper handy, great, or something that you can just tick things off on your phone, also great. And we're going to learn together. We're going to learn some Torah, and we're going to learn some things that are a little bit out of the box Torah, but we're going to consider it to be. The texts that we're going to explore tonight are not, I would say they're not explicitly about race. They are about how we perceive ourselves within a society that deals with race. Should we say the bracha for Torah study? Sure. what is there one that the congregation, I mean, I think la'asok b'divrei Torah, is that okay? So I will say it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddusha mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. I'd be very embarrassed right now if I messed that up. But it's okay because we're all here to learn together and we're all human. So there's nothing like humbling the rabbi right on it. Anyway, one of the things that I really encourage is that we take the time to explore what some of these words, what some of these ideas mean. And we realize that there is no one right answer into them. And like the Torah, like there are 70 faces of the Torah that we say, there are all these different facets and ways to jump in and really explore it. So too are there ways to understand the very complex and often difficult way of what our society is and how we function as a society that is struggling to understand race, racism, and this whole concept of being an anti-racist. So let's jump into some Torah. I'm going to share my screen with some slides, and we will, oh, wait, where did it go? Bear with me. Okay. So, Torah of anti-racism. We begin at the beginning. And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created man in God's image. In the image of God, he was created, male and female, God created them. It's a pretty basic text. It's one we just read this past Shabbat in Bereshit, and this idea of B'Tselem Elohim, which was actually on the flyer that went out for this program, it's such a core piece of who we are as Jews. This idea that there's this holy divine spark in each of us, and what does it mean that we are each holy, that we are each somewhat of God. But how does it impact our understanding of race and racism? So take a moment, maybe put some ideas in the chat.
And Rabbi Abbi, Michelle asked if you could please repeat what you said about how the Torah isn't explicit about race, but rather about our place in society.
Okay. So honestly, I think, so the way I look at Torah is that there are, and we'll see how this plays out in the text I've selected. I don't know that there is a specific text that points exactly and says, don't be racist. But there are texts that help us to understand how people are as individuals, and that help us understand how we think about each other and how we think about our place in society and others in society. And we'll see that in the next text that I'm bringing up. And I wanted to pull up if there are any other questions coming in the chat.
Yeah, Abby, do you want us to wait, or would you like us to read the questions now?
Yeah, sure. Read the questions.
All right. Mike asks, what is the significance of the first person plural pronoun in the first sentence?
That is a whole other level of theology that I could drash on that for a very long time. And the idea of our and what does it mean that that God refers to God's self in a plural? And then how does that extend to who we are? I think, honestly, I don't know. The significance to me, though, is that it is sort of this mirror back on us, that there is no singular. God in this part is referred to as Elohim, knowing that there are sort of this this multi-dimensional God figure. And I think that in this, and looking at it as a plural of God, it's this understanding that there will be a plurality in who we are. We are not monolithic. As a Jewish people, we are not monolithic. And I think even in our own personal lives, we don't only have one idea or one side of us. There's always many ways that we work and many ways that we think about, pretty much everything. Have you ever only had one opinion? No.
Rabbi, there was another comment in the chat from Donna, I think, as an example of, society struggling with issues of race, the longstanding portrayal in Western art of God as a white male.
Yes. God is a white male, and many religions have that issue. And by many religions, I mean Judaism and Christianity, to be honest, are the two religions that really focus on what does it mean to have any kind of image or painted and artistic representation of God, at least in Western religions. And they settled on white men, usually older. So it is striking because it does set us up for God to be a white man, and that does shape how we understand race. If from a very early age, we're walking through, I lived in New York for many years, and one of my favorite places to go is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And if I'm walking through with my kids and and we're in the Renaissance painting section, and all of the paintings are, a white God figure, what are they going to take of that? They're my kids, so they're a little mouthy, and they're asking questions like, why are they even painting God? What does that even mean? But they're at least they're asking the question, and they are thinking about it, and something is sinking into them. Does that mean that God is white?
So speaking of kids, Lila, my kid, said, I feel as though it leaves room for a looser definition of God. If we are all created in God's image, there must not be one visible or concrete look about God. Thus, the concept of God's existence must be less tangible, parentheses, unlike other religions or even beliefs within Judaism. So if anything, for me, race shapes my idea of God, not the other way around.
That's beautiful. Yasher Koach. And with that, I'm going to move to the next slide. So we talked about race and society a little bit and how it shapes it. And we look at who are the insiders and who are the outsiders. So this verse is about Zipporah and Moshe. They've already married. They're together. They're starting to build their family. She bore a son whom he named, he being Moses, named Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. So here's Moses. Here is our pivotal figure in the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu, our leader, a figurehead. And he identifies as a stranger. He identifies as an outsider, as someone who doesn't really have a place to be. He was an outsider in Pharaoh's court as the taken in child. He is an outsider at times among the Israelites who are enslaved, and he doesn't quite know where he fits in. And for me, the questions that came up, well, what does this tell us about strangers in the Torah, and what does it mean to have been a stranger? And we see a couple of instances where Abraham welcomed strangers. We should have Hachnasat Orchim, this welcoming of guests, bringing people in. But in this case, it feels as though stranger is not a good thing, that stranger is somehow something other, whether it's something about Moses's features that set him apart, something about his attitude, but there's something about how society is starting to shape up within the world of the Torah that is putting this otherness and we're moving from what it means to be created in God's image to already starting to feel other. So I added some questions. How do we consider strangers today? Who's a stranger? If people want to jump in a little bit and speak, or they want to put in the chat, I'm also fine with that.
Rabbi, just a quick clarification. So for the format for now, you'll show a slide and then you'll ask questions on the bottom, and then you want responses in the chat.
Or people can jump in. I have one more text after this, and then we're going to get in, and then I'll close the share for a little bit. So, but if people want to jump in, they can.
So
An increasing number of Americans believe that immigration and immigrants strengthen the country.
I agree with that.
Don't psychologists?
strangers, okay,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead, Shanna.
No, you.
Mash, I'm going to just stop the share for a moment, and then I'll go back to it so that we can have a little bit, we can unpack this a little bit.
Well, what impacts for me strangers and the way I look at racism is people who do not look like us, who do not act like us, who do not behave like us, because they were not brought up here and we're not used to their ways. These are the strangers that I think when we look at racism, it really us what they mean by stranger. Okay, that's my idea.
Thank you. So how does race impact strangers and this idea of welcoming versus feeling like a stranger and the insider-outsider piece?
When I heard you phrase it that way, this is Anne speaking.
Hi.
It sounded to me like suddenly, very clearly, that the construct of race was meant to create us, to make us strangers, and to chip away from that common humanity that we were grasping for it with the first passage.
I think it's important to put into this discussion that race is not a biological concept, it's a social concept. And that everything we have to look at is through that lens.
So I agree with you wholeheartedly, and both Anne and Donna, the points that you're making, that race is this piece that we, like other pieces, gender, that as our society is growing, evolving, changing, we're starting to disprove and see other facets that we didn't see before. There's a documentary series, I believe it's put out by PBS, called Race, the Power of Illusion. And it's all about, it's very long. And it's all about, one of the first segments actually disproves this idea of race, of the biology of race. There are different things that different groups will have in common, different traits, like I remember when I was having my kids, I was tested for the Ashkenazi panel of genetic diseases. So, but if I was Sephardic, I wouldn't be tested for that necessarily, but we're all Jews. So what does that mean? Well, my ethnic background that informs and you know, the genetic material that dripped down through the generations informs who I am, but it doesn't necessarily make me a race. It's a very complicated piece. And one of the things that biologists and sociologists and anthropologists have found is that people have more in common based on sort of where they're living and where they're, you know, some mutual ancestry than they have based on color of skin. So it is a very complicated thing. And the unfortunate part when we talk about race is how race often gets used against people. Jews know this from the Holocaust, how Jews and race, how that became a thing and was very negative. I don't have to really, I mean, we know this. But it is now looking at it more and more as a social construct, we can see these pieces on how we play into it. So with that, I'm going to go back, I'm going to go to the last text I want to share. Okay. And so this is from Malachi, one of the later prophets. And Malachi is looking at, you know, arguments that have broken out and how the nation is not getting along and that there are all of these problems. And like any good prophet, he stands up and he, you know, proclaims to the people something that is, you know, that's unpopular. That's what prophets do. They stand up and they say the thing that no one wants to hear, but everyone needs to hear. And so he asks, have we not all one Father? Did not one God create us? Why do we break faith with one another, profaning the covenant of our ancestors? I read that. That for me, that took me on a path to where I am feeling at times today. So we asked the question just to think about for a moment, and then I'll close down the screen share. How did we get here, and how do we repair it? So I asked that on two levels. One, how did the Israelites, who at this point I believe are at this point in the Tanakh are more seen as the Jewish people, how did they get there, and how did we get here, where we're having these conversations, where we're engaging in this in these talks that are at times uncomfortable, that are definitely necessary, and yet we're wondering, why do we still need to be having these conversations? Which leads to the second question of, how do we repair it? How do we do, what can we possibly do if it's so big? What is it that we can possibly do to make it better?
And Abby, when you're asking, you're saying, how did we as a Jewish people get here? And how is we as a Jewish people, or just humans in general?
Let's start it with the Jews. Let's start we as a Jewish people. Keep it with us.
Actually, I don't understand the question. How did we get here?
Okay, so let me reshape it a bit.
I'm sorry, this is David. I don't really understand the question. It's so general. What do you mean? How did we Jewish people get here? Get where? You know, get to be Jews, get to be, you know, closet racist. What is it having these? I don't know what your question really is asking.
Okay. Thank you for speaking up so I can clarify it a bit. So how did we get to the point, and no, I don't think we're closet racist. So I mean, how did we get to this point as a Jewish community where we're having conversations about race? How did we get to a point where, so we can think about history a little bit. How did we get from where we like to hold up marching with Heschel and King, that Heschel and King marched together in the 60s and it was beautiful, and we all crossed, and they crossed the bridge, and look at this rich history that the Jewish community has with the Black community. And then we fast forward to now, where what happened? There were several decades that we're kind of glossing over. And so how did we get here to this point today? And then the other part was, how does the Jewish community start to become feeling very fractured on issues like race?
Can I say,
specifically on issues of race.
I have to disagree with you on part of what you're saying. I agree with you that Jews have been very active in the civil rights movement, but many Jews have been racist for a long time. I mean, you walk around now and people talk about the Schwarzes, and they, and you go to Israel and they have a race problem against the Africans that come in. Many Jews are racist. I think if you look at the more modern literature about white privilege and stuff, Jews are experience that phenomenon just like non-Jews do. Maybe we have a little more background in our own, being prejudiced against, but we have that. And I think if you want to talk about how do we get where we are now, I think we got to start admitting to ourselves that we're ain't perfect. We as a people have made mistakes, and we as a people have failed often miserably to stand up. There's some people who have gone and worked for the civil rights movement and other things, and worked for union development stuff. But most of us didn't do anything, or did fail to be anti-racist and even pro-racist.
So I want to be clear that I agree with you. And in the Jews this is part of my own, until I know the crowd and until I know the community that I'm dealing with, I'm a little cautious on how I say and what I say. So, if anything, thank you for ripping off that Band-Aid. I appreciate it. I realize you don't speak for the entire, all 50 some participants on here, but I also really appreciate that you're willing to say it, because I can sit in my office and talk with my colleagues and family members and say the words that you just said, but hearing it come from someone participating in a discussion like this, I think it really just opens up to a richer discussion.
So this is Jana. I just wanted to add to that. So you said, how did we get here as a Jewish community that we're talking about these issues? I think, kind of drawing from my personal experience, I think a lot of the institutions that we as Jews thought were fair based on effort and merit, and that we've benefited from, we're now learning things that suggest that those institutions aren't as fair as we thought they were, or have benefited us in ways that have disadvantaged other people, particularly people of color. And so we're at a moment where our ideals from the Torah may be coming into conflict with what we're realizing about things that we thought we had earned or were rightfully entitled to. And I think the positive thing about that is it's creating this space for these sorts of conversations.
Thanks, Jana. Yeah.
I think also, I know for me, I grew up in Southern Virginia, which was and still is very segregated. And my father was a first generation Jew from Lithuania. And there was this immigrant experience of, look what we've done, like as Jewish people. And I think that, my father was my hero of blessed memory, but I don't think he could see. I know I'm just learning now about white privilege and beginning to understand it. So I think that might have been hard to see.
I agree. And we're going to examine that a little bit. Well, no, we're going to examine that a lot in the next part of this program. I want to point out Judith's comment in the chat about especially the last line. We are very white centric and thinking all Jews look like us. Yes, 100%. All Jews are not white. There is a strong community of Jews of color, and that is a broad term. Jews of color can refer to Jews of Asian descent, South American, Indian descent. Jews of color may be Black. I believe the number is that in Greater Washington, according to one of the most recent population survey, about 7% of the Jewish community of Greater Washington considers themselves to be Jews of color. So that's 7% isn't an insignificant number when we think about, our whole community. And yes, we say Ethiopian Jews are not who expected to be welcome in Israel as Jews were not. Let's also think about Jews of color who are in synagogues here, in the US and North America. Are they, when they walk into synagogues, do they automatically feel welcome? We have a whole webinar on that. You can check it out on JCRC on our Facebook page. There are definitely more ways where we can do better moving out of this, what I've heard called is, Ashkenazi normative thinking, that, Jews are only like me, us. And I'm loving what's going on here in the chat. Yes, like Jews have been part of white flight. We've moved from certain areas. Like think about, I think about the synagogues where I grew up. One of them was also a Bethel, but part of that, as I've heard, Rabbi Harris heard of the Bethel franchise. So but it was Bethel in South Jersey. So Bethel in South Jersey talks about how it was the days back in Camden, New Jersey. If you've heard anything about Camden, New Jersey, not a place where there is a Jewish community at the moment. And then they moved from Camden to the west side of Cherry Hill, a suburb. But then the west side started, quote unquote, changing. And they then moved to yet another location, Voorhees, another suburb. So, and it became, where's the population living? Where are our members living? But yes, there's definitely a certain amount of white flight in keeping up with where the members want to live. And whether we can say that that's been a negative, we can say it's been a neutral, we can say that, they do, a congregation does what they have to do to survive. And frankly, I was not the executive director, nor am I on their board to make those decisions. So I'm not going to say one way or the other. But yes, it's an example right there. And wow. So if Noel would drive. Oh, okay. I was married at the second New Bethel. Okay. There is also this idea of the model minority myth. So Lila, do you want to bring that up? Please feel free to interject and share.
Yeah, I just to answer Stacey's question. Yeah, that's what I was referring to. Obviously, the model minority myth is applied to Asian Americans on a broad sense, just considering the history that's connected to it. But I do think it's relevant to consider on a more theoretical standard, the way that Jews are seen as a higher up source of power in society, and the thought of, oppressing Jews would be punching up, as opposed to punching down with other minorities that are marginalized as seen by the economic demographics in the country. So I think that's kind of what I was getting at. And we do have a connection, I think, with Asian Americans in that oftentimes I think we are looked to as an example of, look, the Jews could get out of their issues, why can't you, to other minorities, and then also just the clear pitting against each other that occurs within the Black and the Jewish communities that I think needs to be talked about in order to be overcome.
Yes, that is. I mean, I've seen those pieces that you're talking about, and I do think that there is the certain amount of privilege that ends up happening because, as someone else, listed above, said above, white Jews can hide the strangeness, so we get to do the minority thing in a little easier way than, say, the Asian community, and it does become easier to be passing. So with that, I want to move to an activity that is based off of Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And let me, I'm going to share my screen again because there's a bunch of them. So with this, what I'm going to do is read through the, it's not this screen. Okay, I'm going to read through the statements, and I want you to just tick off, like either make like a mark or a yes or a no with the statement. Don't what's your immediate gut feeling on this? We're going to have a chance to go into breakout rooms after these questions, and you'll be able to discuss them with each other a little bit and then come back to the big group. So for now, this is just I'm going to read them, and and then we'll be able to go into breakout rooms. Okay. So, understanding privilege. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. Now, I also want to say that these statements are looking at privilege through lenses of race, a little bit on class, as well as religion. So you're going to find some, so you'll see how they work through. I am not concerned about my race negatively impacting my ability to have financial stability, credit cards, loans, or fair housing opportunities. I can look at the mainstream media and find people of my race represented fairly and in a wide range of roles. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or closely watched by store employees because of my race. If an officer pulls me over, I never question if it is because of my race. I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work against me. I would never think twice about calling the police when trouble occurs. I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial, ethnic, or religious group. My religious views are reflected by the majority of government officials and political candidates. I can assume that I will not have to go to work or go to school on my religious holidays. Food that honors my religious practices can be easily found in any restaurant or grocery store. Implicit or explicit references to religion where I work or go to school conform to my religious beliefs. And implicit or explicit references could be things like music, signage, artwork, things like that. Implicit might be words like how a vacation is referred to. I do not need to worry about the ramifications of disclosing my religious identity to others. So when you go into breakout rooms, there are 3 questions to consider, and we're going to try and have those questions broadcast into the rooms as well. What surprised you? What was difficult, either to realize, to hear, or to sort of and how you experienced that question? And then how have you experienced privilege or a lack of privilege? If anyone would like to take some time now to share some of the things that came up in your breakout groups. And then we're also going to, I have one more slide that I'm going to share after that with a graphic. But first, I'd like to hear from you. What surprised you? How was this exercise for you? And what's privilege looking like right now? Mm-hmm.
This is Kristen. I think our group just started to scratch the surface, being that, you know, there were folks from different age, different backgrounds, but reflected mostly on what folks had experienced in terms of gender, specifically the women who had worked in male-dominated industries and fields, and some whose current housing where they could live as Jews that maybe 50 years ago they would not have been able to live in that area. And we also spoke about, you know, understanding white privilege, and people were reflecting on having read Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and the book White Privilege. But then many of us feeling left in the spot of, okay, now what? We're starting to understand our privilege. Now what? And then the breakout room was over.
Great. Yes, Susan.
We talked more about where we grew up and how if we felt different in any way, and if that difference was attributable to privilege. Not necessarily, but it was probably the most, I think the statement that was one of our people said is she had a sense growing up of otherness, but until she went out into the real world, she didn't necessarily realize that otherness is not necessarily the same. And that's where privilege comes in, when you recognize that if it's not the same, then somebody's more privileged than somebody else. And it's a question at which point in our lives we recognize that and we absorb that, and it varies with everybody. I think we all feel privilege, and that is not a surprise.
So I was talking about this exercise with a colleague of mine who does a lot of community work. She's not clergy, but she works with a lot of clergy, and she's a Black woman, Christian, and she was telling me about doing this exercise. And of course she's going through, she's clicking off. She's like, yeah, no, I get followed in stores. I worry about the police. But then when she got to the part where it started to talk about religion, something clicked for her. She said, oh, I never thought about what it's like to be Christian in this society, and that I have some privilege here. I never, like, it hadn't occurred to her. And it was this, and when she and I were speaking about it, and I thought about it, it's like, oh, I mean, I always just felt it I always just felt that, well, my holidays would be considered second rate, or, not as fun to sing about during, in the winter time. But, I just assumed that that's just what it felt like. I never knew what it was like to feel in the majority in that way. And when we had that experience of sharing, it was like, oh, like everyone has some aspect of privilege, and everyone has some aspect where they don't. And it was a really powerful moment that the two of us were sharing. And it's what I'm hearing was also happening in your group, Susan. Would anyone else like to share what was surprising? What any of the statements that you reacted to, or you had some sort of feeling about that you weren't expecting?
I'm sorry. My name is Judy Baldinger, and I wasn't in the group for very long. I was at a Shiva call, and I got here really late. So this may be really off the track, but when you talk about white privilege and feeling that way as a child, I was working class poor. So the privilege thing wasn't even part of, everybody was the same though, more or less. So when did I have some experiences? When I graduated college and went to try out for a job with the telephone company, which I didn't get. And my parents assured me that it was because of anti-Semitism. And I have no idea if that is true, because I wasn't the person I am today. So I might have been absolutely wrong. So I guess what I'm saying is sometimes you don't know what it is that's doing what to you, if that makes any sense.
It does. And I think that I also think you're naming something that is hard. When we see the words white privilege, privilege, I think, at least for me, when I first heard it, was this sort of well, it's this elevated class, and people of privilege are those that are able to afford the fancy vacations, and the kids of privilege all got cars when they turned 16 and 17, and none of those were me growing up. Privilege was something that I'm like, but I have struggles. There are things in my life that definitely feel like a struggle to me. And, thinking about, my father grew up in a very working class neighborhood, and his family lived at or around the poverty line. And if you ask him, say, I didn't have any privilege growing up, but he went to college. He was the first one. He and his sister were the first ones to go to college, and he was a teacher for 40 plus years in the school district, and has a master's degree, all of these things. And when we talk about it, I said, Dad, I understand that financially the privilege wasn't there. Your father had a factory job, and where you were living, you didn't feel privileged. I said, but think about where you were able to go. And that, and when we started to tease that out, that it may not be where we start, but it's where we're able to end up. That was one of the ways that I started to understand privilege. Mm-hmm. Because we can't deny that people come from very different backgrounds, and that it is a hard thing to think about, that it didn't feel so privileged to me growing up. It felt kind of cruddy sometimes, actually.
Hey, Rabbi, this is Gary. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. What I had was a more experiential thing that happened during the breakout. My mic went off and I didn't know how to fix it. And I was talking away and no one understood what I was saying or could hear me. And it was so frustrating, and it reminded me so much of the experience that you touched on, that some of the people touched on in the beginning of the meeting tonight, of you know, when a friend of yours went in to get help and wasn't able to be helped, but then as a white person you came in and helped them, and all of a sudden it was like the lights were on and everything went fine. So it was that sort of, it also reminded me of being in groups with Black friends, and they came in and there was like this extra layer of communication that was taking place in their heads. Like I was just listening and processing in real time, but it looked like they were taking it in, getting rid of trying to process for the stereotypes that they would be seen for, and then trying to undo those and come up with a question that would be acceptable. And it was like this extra work that they had to do that probably applied to every part of their lives.
I think it's a really fascinating extrapolation of that, and thank you.
That's a great way to picture it, or to explain it. Very, very good.
Let me ask.
Oh, I was just going to say, think how exhausting that must be, Gary, right?
I had an interesting experience when I was a teenager. I applied to Sinai Hospital in Detroit, and I went to the department for the interview, and the lady said, "Hi." The lady said to me, and she was Black, "You can come back if you'd like." And then I got back there, and the whole group was Black, and I did not get the job. And I didn't say anything to anyone that could have done anything about it. But then I mentioned something to my great aunt, and she goes, "I give so much money to that hospital, blah, blah, blah." Like she was really irritated, and she was like, "I would have gotten you in the job. But you know what? I wouldn't have been happy there because they didn't want me there." And it was sad because it was a Jewish hospital that, the Jews were supporting. And here it was run by a Black team that didn't want me there. So it was kind of like, I always think of it as reverse, it was reverse. So it's kind of an interesting experience.
No, it sounds like that was something that was very difficult for you and for your family who'd been so deeply involved. And I think about situations like that, where there are so many layers to it, and how do we start to untangle that? And to be very honest, I don't have an answer on it. I think that the question of workplace culture, as someone just put in the chat, the question of what does it mean for someone to be the right fit in a space. We all come to we bring, in everything we do, like it was said before, we do bring a certain amount of racism. And I think that I'm still working my way through Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. There were many books on my reading list. And so I'm going through a lot of them. And I don't think of it as a reverse racism, but I think about things that Kendi is saying about, we all have in us the potential to have these racist viewpoints, these things that turn that kind of click in a negative way against another. And whether that's someone of our own race, of our own gender, of our own faith group, we all, or another one, we all have that in there, and there's like that potential for it. And this idea of being anti-racist isn't saying that like, oh, I'm not racist, I never do anything bad, I love all people and don't see colors and all of that. No, it's more of this, we recognize this imperfection, and we recognize that we need to work through it. And part of the recognizing it is we talk about what do we do next? What do we do now? Discussions like this are crucial in the what do we do now? Because we are, if we're going to look at the idea of anti-racism, and we're going to really engage in this work and looking at dismantling systemic racism, we have to be able to look at a situation and say, what's going on here? What am I bringing to it? What might the others in the room be bringing to it? Like I said, it must be exhausting to have to try and be heard. It must be exhausting to be thinking about, am I getting hired because of my skin? Am I being hired? Am I not being hired because of my race or religion? Will what I say be heard by everyone? How will I be received? So once we realize that all of that's there, those are the moments where we start to break it down and we start that important work of dismantling. One more comment, and then I want to show another slide and discuss that a little bit. Anyone? Bueller? Yes. Ijoma Olawu's book, So You Want to Talk About Race, is phenomenal. That just popped up in the chat box as well. phenomenal book. And it's to be honest, it's a much easier read than Kindy. It's a more familial kind of read. So, okay. I'm going to share my screen again to show. Okay, so we can do that. So where do we go from here? This is a graphic. Now, we've seen the equality and equity graphic. We've seen it as, well, let's build the boxes up, let's move the boxes around, we can shuffle them. One of the pieces that that was pointed out to me and I read in a few articles is the graphic where we give the boxes and the tools and the higher ladders and stuff to the person who is considered to be, smaller in stature. We're inherently saying that the person who needs the help is at his or her core, at their core, less than, smaller, a physically diminutive being in our society. And what I really liked about this graphic, and I'm trying to learn a little bit more about the diversity, equity, inclusion firm that developed it. It looks like they're a firm that focuses on DEI work, specifically in outdoor education and outdoor settings. So that's cool. But they made a point of making each person the same size. And I think that's key. And when we look at taking equality, in some ways, everyone's on the same type of field. There might be, the slope is going up, but 3 people are all starting out as the same 3 people. Think of, 3 kids, they're all in the same kindergarten class. I have a kindergartner, so that hits home. 3 kids are all in the same kindergarten class. And you know that they're all going to get the same thing. If they're MCPS students, they all receive the same Chromebook. And some of those kids have parents who are able to open up the Chromebook, know what to do, know how to get them online, and they know that the internet's going to be reliable. It's going to be great. And they're going to be there and be able to sit next to them and help them. So they might be the kids that are, able to see over the fence really high. Then we have the second kid. It's a little harder. Parent might be there. Maybe the Chromebook is a little glitchy, though they don't quite know what to do with it. And then you have the third student, their parent, they don't even have reliable internet at home. So what are they going to do? I mean, forget seeing over the fence. They can't even turn on their Chromebook. They can't even get there. and everyone tried to start out the same. So we have equity. Okay, so we'll build things up. We'll give some pieces, some different tools. We'll create hubs. We'll create different spaces where people can.
Your internet works?
My internet now works.
Okay.
Okay, if you can please mute, thanks. You might be we try to make it so that people have their so that realizing that the same tools aren't going to work for everyone. So what is it that we can do to help people? Maybe it's a person who has a learning difference or a special learning need. Well, we can help in that way. Or maybe they need more, they need help accessing stable, reliable internet. So we give them the different bricks to help boost them. And we look at that as equity, making sure that in some way the playing field can be accommodated and tweaked in a way that it's equal. However, equity is great. Equity is needed. And then we then get to the next question of, so can we exist with equity? And I have colleagues and a few colleagues of mine and I, we talk about, no, at this point, it's like, yes, we need equity and we can't stop there. We need to look further and dismantle it, tear down the fence entirely, and that's called justice. That's dismantling systemic racism and being able to say, we realize that the fence, that the barrier that's there, if we just keep building up blocks, okay, how many blocks are we going to have? But if we can eventually get to a point where there's no fence at all, where the system is not flawed in that way, imagine what it could look like. So I want to stop the share. So that's the next question. We talk about privilege, we talk about anti-racism, we talk about equity, but really, where do we go? And I think that the justice image it's an ideal, it's aspirational, and it is really, really hard. So and honestly, I'm not quite sure how we get there, but that's why we have discussions like this one, so that we can start to think about it. Thoughts, feedback, anything. What do you think of that graphic? Yeah, Gary.
Sure. Well, I really liked something that you didn't mention in the graphic, which was in the last one. The ground in the beginning was very, very uneven. And the ground in the distance that you saw was much more smooth and even. And even though the people were on unequal heights, they were all able to freely go where they wanted. And the point was that the land is more smooth in the distance. So that was my take.
Right. So the land is more smooth and we can't even see it until we tear down that big old fence in the way.
Yeah. Thanks.
So that's a huge piece of it is, once we take care of, once we take out the huge barrier, imagine the possibilities for what could be ahead. And what I really liked is, so they used water, it seems, like water in the sunrise, like, oh, wow, imagine what could happen. I really need to find out more about that firm. I'm liking this graphic more and more.
So Abba, I love the graphic. But I agree that it's hard because the fence is really some of our basic institutions. So what would it mean to dismantle, our education system? Or what would it mean to get rid of the police? And what are the costs of that? So it's both, kind of the most appealing solution, perhaps, but also the most difficult.
Yeah,
100%.
it's,
I just wanted to, before we ended, that's a wonderful plug and a segue for the next session. We had initially had scheduled the second session to be about racism and anti-Semitism, and the third session to kind of focus on the question of where do we go from here? What would it mean to go from equity to justice? What are some of the efforts that are going on in our community that are attempting to do that? Because of the availability of a wonderful speaker on racism and anti-Semitism who could be available only for the third session, we're going to switch. So I just wanted to say that the next session, which is this coming Monday, the 26th, is really going to focus on that question, you know, what would it mean to go from equality to equity to justice? And, you know, what are some of the efforts that are going on in our local community to do that? And then the third session, which will be on Sunday, November 8th, will be on connections, interactions, tensions between anti-racism and anti-Semitism. And you having signed up, you don't have to attend all three sessions. Of course, we hope that
We would love to have you there, though.
We'd love to have you there, but you could attend, one of the next two or both of the next two. So, you know, we had said that we would be mindful of people's time, and I want to give Rabbi Abbi a chance to wrap up, but.
And let's make sure we let Kathy give her comment too.
Okay. I think Kathy's muted.
sorry, it's passed. I was kind of echoing what Janice said, tearing down the fence. I mean, we could go all the way. It's a huge, very big, old, complicated fence. And I think if we can work on some of that equity in the meantime, like that's a great long-term goal, but I mean, tearing down the fence, I've heard lots of people say it includes, rewriting our Constitution because it was written by a couple of white privileged guys. Like, therefore, how can it possibly govern our country now? And I don't want to get into that, but I'm just saying that fence it's very complicated.
It's old and deep.
And old, right.
And yes, and you make an excellent point. I for one don't, and this is, I speak as me, not on behalf of JCRC or Bethel or anything else, but me. I don't know that I want to completely tear down everything. I've seen police forces that do wonderful, amazing things. I've seen police officers who've done horrible things. I've seen schools that are fabulous and amazing and school systems that aren't. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. And when we start to make, and I think that gets into some of the tension of how do we take action? We don't always know. Okay. We don't always know how we're going to take action. We don't always know how we should take action or to what level, because of all of the stuff that it can sometimes bring up. How deep do you go? How much is enough? Are we doing it the right way? So those are all the questions that I think about when I talk about words like equity, justice. I've seen some people use it as liberation, which brings in a whole other issue and thought process on this. And yes, and the reality is that our country was built in. And as we look back at that history, there are some deep flaws. there are also some wonderful things. So we learn how to hold both, and we learn how to exist with that tension and be uncomfortable in it as we move forward. So I thank you. Bring your questions, think about all this, bring it next week. I look forward to teaching and talking and learning with all of you again. And thank you so, so much for, for having me join your congregation for this evening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Abbi. And thanks to everyone for coming. It was great to see you all. So thanks so much, and hope to see you next Monday night, the 26th at 7:30 p.m.